India and Pakistan mark 72 years of freedom from British colonial rule amid heightened tensions in Kashmir. Hello, I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat.
One nation, one constitution.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi doubling down, defending India's decision to strip Kashmir of its special status. Hailing the controversial move as a major achievement, Modi was speaking from the ramparts of the historic Red Fort in New Delhi as India celebrated its Independence Day. On Wednesday in Pakistan, it also celebrated its independence, with Prime Minister Imran Khan going on the diplomatic offensive. In a strongly worded speech delivered from Pakistan-administered Kashmir, he said India had committed a strategic blunder and would pay, quote, a heavy price for scrapping Kashmiri autonomy. The valley remains under security lockdown and a communications blackout, with hundreds detained. To discuss the ongoing Kashmir dispute, I want to bring in our panel. Ather Zia is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley. She joins us from Denver, Colorado. And joining us from New Delhi, Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. He is a professor and dean of the Jindal School of International Affairs. Mosharraf Zaidi joins us from London. He was a former principal advisor to Pakistan's foreign minister. And from New York, Jonathan Wachtel joins us. He was former director of communications at the US mission to the United Nations. Welcome to you all to the show. Thanks so much for joining us. Dr. Chaulia, I want to start with you. You are in New Delhi. We've seen lots of headlines about this, but this was actually part of Narendra Modi's re-election strategy, correct? Changing the status of Kashmir. What brought all this about?
Sure. I think he's a hardcore Indian nationalist, and Mr. Modi and his party have for many decades been agitating both in and out of power to change this special status for Kashmir. And their logic is that, creating this autonomous, a separate, giving it a kind of a separate status was preventing it from being mainstreamed into the, national, Indian national fabric. And so the idea that Mr. Modi had right from his first term was to scrap this Article 370 and Article 35A. These two provisions of the Indian Constitution gave Jammu and Kashmir, this region, a separate flag of its own constitution, powers over residents who can come in and who can leave the place, who can reside and who are considered to be inhabitants of this valley, or especially of the Kashmir Valley, which is overwhelmingly Muslim majority. So I think from Mr. Modi's point of view and from the Indian nationalist point of view, it was necessary to put this behind us, because otherwise it was creating this permanent stage of alienation of the Kashmiris who believe that they actually don't belong to India fully. So this is a kind of a move for full integration of Kashmir into India, and it's been overwhelmingly supported by people across the country, except in the Kashmir Valley itself, where there is a alienation and separatist sentiment. But outside that, you look at the public opinion, look at the parliament, look at the mass sentiment. So in a way, you're right. It is an election promise that is fulfilling, and it's a structural transformation he's trying to do. In a way, moving past the old dynamic where Pakistan would claim the Indian Kashmir as part of its own territory, try to grab it by force or by fomenting separatism. Pakistan was utilizing this special status in Indian Kashmir to foment more anti-India alienation. And I think Mr. Modi believes that the autonomy did not work. So now we are going for assimilation and integration.
Mosharraf Zaidi, I saw you shaking your head there during the doctor's answers. Obviously, as an advisor to Pakistani governments, you have a very different view.
Well, regardless of my status formerly as an employee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Pakistan, I also happen to be a human being, and so the situation in Kashmir is not an India-Pakistan dispute. This is the Indian attempt at obfuscation of the issue. Pakistan has never used Article 370 or 37A ever, because Pakistan doesn't recognize India's claims over Kashmir. In fact, neither does the United Nations, because the United Nations Security Council explicitly considers Kashmir to be a disputed territory, an international dispute that can only be resolved through the actualization of the will of the people of Kashmir. And interestingly, the citation of the will of the Indian people in the matter of Kashmir is irrelevant, just as irrelevant as the will of the Pakistani people, because Kashmir does not belong to either. Kashmir belongs to Kashmiris, and the reason there's been a separatist movement there, and the reason that India has had to murder 80,000 people, its troops have had to rape innocent women and bury people in mass graves, not 100 years ago or 50 years ago, but as recently as the late 1990s, and the reason that it's conducted an utter and total media blackout today is because Indian troops are back to their old tricks in Kashmir, which is to suppress the rights of Kashmiris who are resisting this brutal attempt by India to reassert what has never been India's to assert.
Okay, I want to get to the other guests, but Dr. Chaulia had his hand up there. Obviously wants to rebut a couple of those things. It's getting pretty heated pretty early on, as we expect with this division. Of course, Dr. Chaulia, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to point out that Pakistan is internationally recognized as a violator of human rights. It has been butchering the people of Balochistan and left, right, and center. The Pakistani occupied Kashmir, there are uprisings against the military domination there, and the claim that the Kashmiris are somehow separate. Well, Pakistan occupies 1/3 of Kashmir. Why are they not vacating that?
Has CGTN adopted comedy as one of the offerings during this program? Because that's pretty funny.
Well, obviously we don't make jokes when human suffering is obviously on the line here. Let's try and calm things down with our other guests. Ather Zia, you have a Kashmiri background. There are lots of reports of communications being cut off in parts of Kashmir, India-controlled parts of Kashmir. What's the situation, as far as you know, on the ground there?
The situation in Kashmir right now is fast unfolding as a humanitarian crisis. From the information blackout, the curfews that are pervading, that we are seeing for the past 11 days now. So that's one part of the equation, what India is doing right now. But the other part of the equation is just a small exemplar that you just saw between the two guests. This is the situation that Kashmiris are caught in. It's almost as if Kashmiris have no voice. India has always made us out to be the proxy war, or it's a bilateral dispute, and then it suddenly becomes a law and order situation. But that's not the case. When the Kashmir issue was taken to the United Nations Security Council by Jawaharlal Nehru, it was clear, categorically, the Kashmir question before it became an India-Pakistan question. So the question of autonomy, I think the world community also needs to know and also needs to ask the question, like, why autonomy in the first place? Why was this region autonomous? And why 370? And why are people protesting? Why are they caged if it's supposed to be for their development? So I think those are all pertinent questions that need to be asked. And right now, as Kashmir is caged, as people are on the ground facing a humanitarian crisis, communication blackouts, there are mass arrests going on, and in South Kashmir, there are reports trickling out that there are young boys who are being pulled out from their beds. So that's the situation in Kashmir right now, and that question needs to be asked by the global community, that these are people protesting, and these are people silent. And once this siege is lifted, we don't know what's going to happen. So I really urge the world community to think about the Kashmiri people as the foremost carriers of this tragedy. And they have been protesting for the last 77 years, even before India and Pakistan were two nations. They have been protesting since 1931 for a sovereign nation. And now this has been hijacked into a bilateral dispute. And then when India talks about it, it suddenly becomes a law and order situation, a domestic dispute. That's not the case.
Okay, Jonathan Wachtel in New York, I want to bring you in. You have a lot of experience as the UN, as the former spokesperson of the US mission there. Closed consultations is a word that you hear a lot as well. The UN Security Council is going to do that over the next 24 hours or so when it comes to Kashmir. But is this really a UN problem? Of course, there was a border enforced by the UN in 1948. Just with the history lesson, of course, the division of Kashmir resulted in the end of the British Empire, the Maharaja, who was more Hindu, and the population more Muslim. We see those divisions continue today. Does the UN have a role here? And what about the US, too? Trump made some comments a couple of weeks ago, which seemed to have really played into Modi's hands here.
You know, Nathan, the UN really does have a role here. It did from the onset in codifying at least the international perspective on this conflict. The reason that it needs to be examined by the UN, and of course it's intelligent to take the dispute, of course, into closed-door sessions in the Security Council, because as the beginning of this program shows, it's just such a tense and contentious issue here, and tempers are going to flare. But the primary issue here is that this is about regional security, and it's about peace and security, which is at the center of what the UN's about. And it involves several countries. It's not just India and Pakistan here. A small portion, you know, albeit of Kashmir, is actually under Chinese control. So you know, this is not a simple matter, and there are other factors here, including impact of the Afghan peace talks and how that might affect the Kashmiri situation. Concerns that India has that you might have an outcome of things settling in Afghanistan ending up being a flare-up of terrorist activity stemming from Islamist groups in Kashmir. So this is a very complicated, very delicate problem, and really cooler heads need to prevail here. Sadly, people are caught in the middle of this. Millions of people, millions of Kashmiris who are needlessly in a dire situation, and hopefully, you know, through the help of the UN and attempts to try to diffuse this tension, the Kashmiri people can come out of this in at least a better place.
Dr. Chaulia, I want to just go back to the rationale here by Indian Prime Minister Modi, but before that I just want to play a soundbite that we have from him, because he's speaking in very lofty terms in terms of the decision here and what it means for Kashmir and the Indian people as well.
The hopes and aspirations of the citizens of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh are our collective responsibility. Their dreams should get new wings, and this is our responsibility as well. And for those dreams, all our countrymen should also take responsibility, whatever the difficulties. We will try to overcome.
So, Dr. Chaulia, we touched on the popularity of this move in India too, but India is also home to a large, tens of millions, Muslim minority as well. Could this exacerbate tensions, especially considering the nationalist tendencies that you alluded to before?
No. You see, the 180 million Muslims in India are peaceful and are well integrated into various communities spread across. The issue with the Kashmir Valley, where the 7 million Muslims is different because they have had this special status, and so they had like a ghettoization with their own, you know, enclave mentality, as in they felt like they were not part of the rest of Indian Muslims. But Indian Muslims overwhelmingly have no issues. In fact, most of them are very patriotic, and they supported Mr. Modi's decision. So they are, in fact, in tune with the rest of the country. So, and that's the reason is very clear. You see, that goes back to the rationale as well, because they are intermixed and interspersed with other religious groups. There's interdependence. People live together. There's no kind of exclusivity like you've had in Kashmir for so long. So that needs to go. And I think that's the only way India will be able to stabilize Kashmir. And just going back to the point about the humanitarian crisis and so on, a lot of this is exaggerated. I mean, essential supplies are moving. There's not a single casualty that's happened so far in the last 11 days since the decision was made. There's not been any so-called large-scale uprising or incident. And gradually, step by step, sector by sector, many of these restrictions are being lifted. And you will not be even talking about it in another 4 or 5 days. So, and there are going to be elections, there's going to be a new assembly, there's going to be, a union territory with the legislature. So the new reformed Jammu and Kashmir will still have a democratic process, unlike what you have in the Pakistani side, which is complete, military jackboots crushing the aspirations of Kashmiris on that side. And so I think, we must give due diligence, due accordance to procedure as per the Indian Constitution, as per democratic practices. It's going to happen, and the will of the majority, you see, will prevail in any democracy. It's always a choice, and I think that must be respected.
Okay, I want to bring obviously Mosharraf Zaidi here in first, but first of all, I want to just play a clip of Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan as well, and talk about the strategy of Pakistan over this issue going forward after that. Let's hear.
As per our information, they have made a more horrendous plan to divert world attention from their move in Kashmir. They plan action in Azad Kashmir. In view of this, today I am giving Narendra Modi a message from here. You take action, your bricks will be reciprocated with stones.
Now, Mosharraf, Khan's strategy here seems to be partly to internationalize the problem. Obviously, writing letters to the United Nations, saying that Modi has internationalized this issue. But as you know, India has seen this as a domestic issue for decades. What's Pakistan's reaction and game plan going to be going forward?
I think Pakistan has a set of limited options because it's dealing with a neighbor by the name of India that operates in a completely different dimension than the rest of the world. But I think that, a lot of the responsibility for the sort of fantasy fiction that we just heard from my dear friend in New Delhi, a lot of the responsibility for that actually has to be shouldered by the Western media and by global voices. The fact that we keep referring to Narendra Modi and the RSS and the BJP as Indian nationalists when clearly they are Hindu supremacists is part of the reason why things have gotten to where they are. Now, given the commercial interests that many nations and entities, commercial and corporate entities, as well as governments have in India, I don't think this is about to change. And that means that Pakistan's range of options is limited. What I'm hoping is that the extremists in Pakistan, who number in a much smaller minority, Pakistan is a widely ascetic and tolerant nation that has never elected any Muslim supremacists or any terrorists or any extremists, unlike India, which has just re-elected with a thumping majority a Hindu supremacist government. So what I'm hoping for from within Pakistan is for cooler heads to prevail and for the Pakistani strategy on this to continue to highlight the international nature of this issue. This has always been an international issue. There is no attempt to internationalize it. From the very get-go, from 1948, the UN Security Council has recognized and defined and codified the Kashmir issue as an international dispute. Okay. So there is nothing that India can say or do that will change that. And the only thing India is doing now is it's ensuring that the few sellout Kashmiris who were happy to work for New Delhi over the last 70 years, those men and women and their families will now also become separatists. They will now also become seekers of Pakistani patronage and seekers of global attention. I think that in 4 or 5 days we'll be talking about Kashmir more, and I fear that in 4 or 5 months we'll still be talking about Kashmir and the dead bodies of young men and women that are being trotted out of Srinagar and buried.
I just want to move on a little bit, otherwise this could be a sort of boxing match between our Indian and Pakistani voices here. Ather Zia, you mentioned earlier that you felt Kashmiris were caught in between these two powers. I think we're seeing evidence of that rhetorically right here. But on the ground, the changes that are due to take effect in October, essentially taking away the status that Kashmir has now, and essentially being more direct rule from Delhi and also, New Delhi, and also the changes of property rights and people being able to buy property from outside Kashmir. What difference do you think that will make on the ground?
Well, I feel with the revocation of 370, which was merely symbolic now, because what it meant for the Kashmiris was that we had territorial sovereignty, that the right to franchise was theirs, that people could not come out from other parts of India to Kashmir, and then that territorial sovereignty was protected. Apart from that, I think India has legally, with different statutes since 1947, entered into Kashmir. 370 was a tunnel through which all the other laws, including India's fundamental rights, which has a special clause for detention, which has been used in Kashmir so long, and it's been used by different predetermined governments. And when we talk about electoral democracy in Kashmir, I, in my own work, call it the politics of democracy, because the very legal foundations of elections that are held in Kashmir, they've always been illicit. And United Nations had even at that time issued a notice to India that they could not be held because the dispute was still sub judice. So that's something that we need to consider, that the democracy in Kashmir is not democracy, it's politics of democracy. And India, from New Delhi, has always been planting predetermined governments, and those are the collaborators that Mr. Zaidi was talking about. And those are the ones who very recently told India that if you revocate Article 370, there's no one who inside Kashmir is going to hold the Indian tricolor, and that's what we see unfolding. And I also want.
Sorry, both of you. Dr. Chaulia, can you just hold on for a second? Because I want to bring in Jonathan Wachtel here as well. You know, obviously, with these bitter divisions, the United States obviously has been watching this situation. US President Trump actually said that at one point that he was asked to mediate on the Kashmiri crisis. That proved to be wrong. I don't think I ever saw a faster rejection by the Indian Foreign Ministry. But what role can the White House and Washington play here, considering the geopolitics of the region and the US's closeness that we've seen with New Delhi, but also the need to stay on the side of Pakistan with Afghanistan?
The United States absolutely, Nathan, needs to be playing an intense role in the discussion here. The problem is obviously that you know, the United States wants to have friendly relations with both powerhouses in that region. For a variety of reasons. You know, with India, things have really moved in a very good place in terms of two very large, strongly democratic nations, fundamentally trying to push back at China and Russian aspirations and trying to find a balance geopolitically. And Pakistan, of course, is now playing a more positive role with the advent of Imran Khan in the leadership there, of trying to distance from the past in which Pakistan has, whether earned or not earned, and this reputation as a dangerous place with militants and terrorists, and it hasn't been good for that country either. And as you mentioned, of course, Pakistan's crucial role in trying to resolve the Afghan conflict and allow the United States to extricate itself militarily from there. So the United States needs to be involved here. Absolutely fundamentally important, given that tensions in the early 90s between Pakistan and India almost came to nuclear blows. Well, that prospect is scary as all can be, and we absolutely need at least U.S. mediation between the two capitals, Islamabad and Delhi, to be taken part here. It doesn't have to be visually said, any of this. It can be negotiations, quiet negotiations. And the other issue here, Nathan, is at the United Nations, it's going to be very complicated to get some sort of resolution carried out here, because Russia, which has veto power, has often sided with India in this particular dispute. And I mentioned China earlier, and China, of course, has to decide how it wants to react to this dangerous situation.
Yeah, I mean, I just want a quick follow-up with you, Jonathan, because 2 out of the 3 wars that India and Pakistan have fought have been over Kashmir. And as you rightly said, both are obviously nuclear powers as well. Do you see a risk of war here?
Absolutely, there's a risk of war. We saw already fighting pick up in a, you know, it wasn't open warfare, but following the attack against Indian troops in a terrorist attack a few months ago, India's very strong response, the downing of the Indian plane, things got extremely dangerous then. Well, arguably, the situation has taken a new level of danger here. And, you know, we really do, the guest a short time ago said cooler heads need to prevail here. Absolutely, cooler heads need to prevail here.
Well, Dr. Chaulia, cooler heads, I mean, is Modi prepared to go to war over this?
No, not at all. You know, Nathan, I would say that this, you know, moment is indeed a delicate one, and a lot depends on how Pakistan responds, because for them, they are seeing their, you know, dream of grabbing Kashmir by force slipping away, and Modi consolidating control over the Indian part of Kashmir.
Let me go to Mosharraf Zaidi. Would Pakistan go to war over this?
Pakistan is not, has never sought war. Pakistan is a smaller country, and militarily, financially, economically, a weaker country. It makes no sense for Pakistan to go to war. Pakistan has not sought war even in February after India attacked Pakistan. Pakistan only conducted defensive actions, which led to the downing of an Indian plane, but the Indian pilot that was captured was handed over almost immediately. Every instinct in terms of Pakistan's core regional relationships, whether it's Saudi Arabia or it's China, both those countries, and their sage advice to Pakistan is to focus on the economy. So there's no incentive, and there's nothing pushing Pakistan to war other than one single factor, and that is the extremism and fanaticism of New Delhi. So as long as the United States and other countries can prevail over.
Yeah, I just want Dr. Chaulia. Dr. Chaulia.
Hotbed of extremists, and worldwide recognized to be a hotbed of extremists. I think they need to be restrained. If Pakistan is restrained from promoting its proxy war and jihad in Kashmir, I think there'll be peace and no need to go to war at all.
Okay, I'm going to give the last word to Ather Zia here, because obviously we need to get away from this tension spilling out onto the show. What do you think the future sort of 6 months to a year looks like in Kashmir?
I think it's going to be very tough for Kashmiris, because once they come out of the siege, when the siege breaks down, there is going to be a huge number of protests, and Indian government forces are not known to be easy. They use fatal, indiscriminate force, and that's what we have seen. The United Nations Human Rights Commission report in June 2018 that came out, which reported on this. But this is what I want to say. Kashmiris are looking towards United Nations, and that's what they have done in the last 33 years. Even when United Nations was sidelined by India, they have stood their ground. They have taken their memorandums, even if it was one person receiving that memorandum at the observer headquarters. And right now, the Kashmiris on Twitter are giving the slogan, because they know tomorrow the meeting is going to be held at the United Nations Security Council. China has taken the matter there, and then it's been followed up, and there is going to be some action. And the slogan that they're using is decolonize, demilitarize, self-determination for Kashmir, with an option for independence. I know it's a tall order, but it's not hard to dream.
Ather Zia in Denver. We'll have to leave it there. And from New Delhi, New York, and London, and all points in between, you can see the debate getting very heated there. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C., and thanks so much for being with us.